Stress really isn't what happens to us in life, right? It's how we respond to what happens to us in life. And so whether or not you're going to experience something as stressful depends on both on how you represent it to yourself and how well equipped you are to experience resilience, to how high your threshold is of what it is you do and don't consider stressful.
Hi, welcome to Peak Moment. I'm Janaea Donaldson. I'm in Portland, Oregon with a guest that you've seen before. I'm with Nora Gedgaudas. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Janaea.
Author of Primal Body, Primal Mind, which has been instrumental in our lives with big changes. Thank you for all of us.
Yeah.
And your new book, Rethinking Fatigue, what your adrenals are really telling you and what you can do about it.
Right.
Well, there's a lot of talk about burned out adrenals, stress, fatigue. Tell us what we're seeing.
It's a terminology that's become so entrenched now in our culture that we don't really question that there's such a thing as adrenal fatigue or adrenal burnout. But in fact, there's a little bit of a myth there. What people think of as adrenal fatigue or adrenal burnout rarely has anything to do with the adrenal glands themselves.
Really?
Yeah.
Whoa.
So it has to do with, as with many things, it's a communication issue. So there are communication issues we have with relationships. We can look at things sociologically and see the breakdown of our society being all kinds of miscommunications going on. But this is also true within the body, that is itself a very complex system of interrelationships. And in the case of adrenal dysregulation, now adrenal dysregulation can be real. Adrenal fatigue and adrenal burnout, not so much. And the dysregulation comes in the communication more often than not, and there are other ways of looking at this too, but between the adrenal glands and the brain. The adrenal glands are just a couple of hormone factories. They do what they're told to do by the brain. And so, and the brain interacts with the adrenals in many different capacities. It's not just one particular way. There are different aspects of the brain that get engaged when we're experiencing stress. And so the brain has different ways of detecting what might be stressful. And our adrenal hormones are our hormones that are oriented towards survival. And of course, survival trumps everything else. So the brain is going to be the primary organ of perception when it comes to stress. And then it sends the signals to the adrenals as to what to do. But these signals can get confused. And there are different brain structures, as I mentioned, that have interactive relationship with the adrenals. Now, for instance, the hypothalamus, which produces corticotropic releasing hormone and stimulates the adrenals to produce cortisol or not to, depending on what it's telling it to do. That part of the brain is very sensitive to other things going on in our environment. And one of the things that can impact that particular brain structure has to do with something called an inflammatory cytokine, an immune cytokine. For instance, if you get a flu bug, your body's going to start to produce interferon as a way of, which is an inflammatory cytokine, which is a way of getting up your natural killer cell activity and fighting the invading organisms. And it turns out that interferon has a profoundly dampening effect on hypothalamic output. There are these little structures in the back of the hypothalamus, and whether that is going to ask your body to produce more cortisol or less depends on, in part, whether it's being dampened by those signals. And these cytokines sometimes block that corticotropin releasing hormone signal and can cause us to feel like we have low adrenal function. And you may in fact show excessively low cortisol, but it may not have anything to do with adrenal fatigue. It may have to do with something like a chronic infection. Or maybe you have an autoimmune condition where you're constantly in a chronic inflammatory state and that is impairing your ability to be able to effectively produce cortisol. And you know, you can't. There's a salivary hormone test called an ASI, which stands for Adrenal Stress Index. Most natural healthcare providers do this test for people. And what an ASI can tell you is how much cortisol you're producing overall, what your overall cortisol burden is, but it can also show you exactly what your daily cortisol rhythms look like. Cortisol is released in a daily circadian rhythm. Okay. And it's normally in balance with another hormone called melatonin, which a lot of people have heard of.
Yes.
Cortisol and melatonin are always completely diametrically opposed to one another. When melatonin's up, cortisol's down. When cortisol is up, melatonin's down. Now, usually, if something's going to dysregulate melatonin, it's a cortisol issue, but sometimes people have trouble making sufficient melatonin, and that can be an issue. But another thing that can dysregulate this is that what coordinates these daily circadian rhythms is a part of our brain called the hippocampus. It's in our temporal lobes right up above the tops of our ears. And that part of the brain has the richest repository of cortisol receptors anywhere in the brain. And that's the part of the brain that helps to mitigate our stress response. Now, we were never designed to be, marinated in cortisol 24/7. Really, the human nervous system is designed to function in what we call a calm, relaxed, parasympathetic state.
Calm and relaxed.
Calm and relaxed.
This does not
99.99%
like
of the time, right?
modern life.
Right? Yeah.
And stress from everywhere. So it's partly I want to back up and have you say, if people think, well, there are people who are aware they're stressed.
Right.
It may be a long-term situation with a parent or
Right.
concern about money, or there's lots of reasons.
Right.
So I just want to back up. It's like, what are the kinds of symptoms that they might be experiencing that would say, that you'd want to say, you might want to take a look here at the adrenals? I'm going to back up to that.
Well, anything that relates to your energy levels at all, if your energy's too low, usually, very often you have type A personalities that are very hyper-driven. Now, they may not be symptomatic in terms of their energy. They think they're fine because they've got enough nervous energy to burn.
Yeah.
It's not real energy, and it's sort of like, how much energy do you have where you don't have to supplement anything, where you don't need coffee, where you don't need,
Any stimulants.
any kind of stimulant
Right.
to get yourself
Okay.
going. And as soon as you ask people, how much energy do you have, they're always like, oh yeah, I've got, where you don't have to drink coffee. Oh yeah, well, And what you see oftentimes in the kind of the high stress executive types, or just type A personality types, is that they will have a tendency to burn the candle at both ends and do all kinds of things like that. And they just sort of go on raw nerves. They're basically pumping out cortisol and adrenaline all of the time, which one of the things to say about cortisol is that, among other things, it is what is called a catabolic hormone. Anabolic builds things up, catabolic breaks things down. So if you're trying to go on adrenaline and cortisol all the time, you're downing the Red Bull, you're drinking coffee, you're doing your caffeinated sodas and things like that, what you're effectively doing is putting your body in a state of chronic breakdown. And in fact, the part of your brain that manages cortisol, which is this delicate hippocampal tissue, begins after a while to break down too. Now, it just so happens that's the part of the brain that is the first thing to go when we start developing dementia or Alzheimer's disease. So, one might ask, well, what are the symptoms of hippocampal dysregulation? Well, these are people that have both trouble falling asleep, trouble staying asleep. They may have, energy crashes late in the afternoon. They have, issues maybe with waking up, and then at midnight they don't know how to wind down again. Very often too, you start seeing memory issues. You start seeing the tip of the tongue syndrome. These are the people that are always forgetting where they put their cell phones, or they don't know where's the TV remote, or where did I put my keys. What's your name again? Oh yeah, that's right. I live with you. I know your name. You know, it's like,
oh dear.
Yeah, exactly. We call these things senior moments, but in fact, they're not really that funny because what it heralds is a state of neurodegeneration.
And isn't necessarily normal either.
It is not normal. It's
Though our
normal if your
culture
brain is
says so.
degenerating to have those kinds of symptoms, but it's not normal for us. And, you know, these kinds of, you know, this sort of neurodegeneration now, you know, this temporal lobe degeneration is starting to show up in younger and younger people. Radiologists are looking at films and saying, wow, you know, this is, I guess we'll just start to call this a normal variant of aging. And there's nothing normal about it, just simply because it's extremely common. So with that, when you're talking about that brand of adrenal dysregulation, you know, the kind of adrenal supplement that is like an adrenal glandular or B vitamins or vitamin C or the kind of the typical things that you get prescribed to support the gland isn't going to do anything. What you need in that case, if you're going to try to do something supplemental, is to take the kind of supplement that is going to target these rhythms more from a brain-based level. And that tends to be more so the adaptogens, like your erythroginseng, ashwagandha, rhodiola, rhamania. Some people call this, there's an herb called tulsi, or some call it holy basil. That's a nice...
And those are meant to support, I just want to get back for a second, those are meant to support from the brain level? Is that what you're saying?
Well, at that, so if you're experiencing some of the symptoms we're talking about that are associated with hippocampal problems, with the temporal lobe-based adrenal issues, then yes, they can be helpful for that. It's not a solution to a crappy lifestyle, or chronic blood sugar dysregulation is another way of generating that type of dysregulation in that part of the brain.
So diets high in carbs, high in sugars, or where your blood sugar is doing this,
yes,
is gonna.
You can set up your brain, your circadian rhythms to start doing that as well, and which means it's your brain that's actually paying the price.
I want to go back for just a second, because when you're talking about, you can do the ASI test, thank you, that shows where cortisol and melatonin, or at least the cortisol, should be higher in the early part of the day and then lower at night, lower in the afternoon, right?
Right. It starts at its highest point in the morning and kind of starts to go, because that's the time of day you're getting up, your energy, whatever, and so it tends to be when your blood sugar is highest. Cortisol is actually a blood sugar hormone. It raises your blood sugar up. So in the morning, cortisol tends to be the highest, and then throughout the day it comes down, and then at night it's supposed to be at its lowest ebb. And that's sort of the normal rhythm. Now it's interesting because if a person has a very well adapted ketogenic approach.
Define ketogenic.
Ketogenic is where you are dependent not on sugar as your primary source of fuel, but on fats as your primary source of fuel, or ketones, which are the energy units of fat, much as glucose is an energy unit of sugar, whatever.
Okay.
So, and in that case, you don't need the same big elevations of cortisol in order to get your energy going in the morning and get you going throughout the day. So, these adrenal stress index tests, sometimes, because they're standardized based on the assumption that everybody's using sugar as a primary source of fuel. But so as somebody who looks at it a little differently, if I see somebody's cortisol lower in the morning and I know that they're, kind of making the switch to more of a fat-based ketogenic diet, like the one I talk about in Primal Body, Primal Mind, then I have to ask the question, do you have issues getting going in the morning? Is it hard for you to wake up? Do you need a cup of coffee to feel like you can get going? Do you feel, down and depressed unless you're something stimulating you all the time? And if they're like, well, no, I wake up fine and my energy's fine and whatever else, then I'll look at it that way, and then I find it less of a relevant finding.
Therefore, it's not a problem because it's lower in the morning than you normally see for sugar eaters, if you will.
And then you just have to talk to the person and say, well, what do you actually experience, to know how to interpret that.
Yes.
Because a lot of these tests are standardized for things that aren't true for everybody, right? So.
Right. And I find valuable in your model of, how cortisol and melatonin are opposite. Helpful to me was to realize that when cortisol comes up in the morning, your melatonin, when you want the melatonin to be high, is at the other end at night, which
Right.
helps us sleep, right? So talk
Right.
to us a little bit about noticing our symptoms from that side, from the melatonin picture side.
Right. Well, when you're not able to produce enough melatonin for whatever reason, you either have a pineal issue, or maybe there is you're not getting enough sunlight during the day, right? Or you live in a place like the Pacific Northwest, where in the wintertime it's kind of like twilight all the time because of all the dark clouds and the rain and whatever else. And there's this sickly trickle of melatonin, and you're not quite getting enough at night, and you're getting too much during the day, and all that kind of a thing. So using a light box, or getting yourself bright light at the times of day when it's appropriate to have it, can sometimes help improve sleep in a person that has that type of dysregulation. And if your cortisol is messed up too, though, and you have skewed rhythms, that's going to affect your melatonin as well. Mm-hmm. And but one of the things I will say is that one of the biggest mistakes, in my view, that you can make is try to manage a low melatonin issue with supplemental melatonin.
That one got my alarm bells going.
Right. It's a common thing people do because it's not toxic. They tried really hard to kill lab rats with it, and they couldn't do it. So then they assumed, well, it must be good for us then. Well, it's a critical hormone for the detoxification of our brain, and I mean, it has a very powerful antioxidant effect, and it has a lot of important functions. Chelating toxic minerals out of the brain and everything else. But guess what? Oral melatonin doesn't normally cross the blood-brain barrier. So, and you get all of the benefits from melatonin strictly from what is called endogenously produced melatonin, the stuff you make yourself. So the better way to enhance your melatonin levels, if you're not making enough, number one, see if there's, what's happening with your light rhythms during the day. If you have seasonal affective disorder, you might want to get a light box and try that or whatever. But you also want to, you could take something called L-tryptophan, which is an amino acid that is a precursor to actually first a precursor to serotonin, which a lot of us associate with depression or whatever. And then serotonin will convert at night to melatonin. All right. Okay. And during the daytime, when you get exposed to bright light, what it does is it shuts down the melatonin production and brings the serotonin production back up again. So when there isn't that bright light to shut down that melatonin production is when we experience things like seasonal affective disorder.
And that can be, it's not something I ever thought I had, but I realized that being up here in the Pacific Northwest this last few months, that kind of sleep disturbance in the middle of the night, not being able to get back to sleep, could well be a factor of that. And if one can't carry around a light box necessarily or whatever, it's good to know what other means we can use to do that. Right. Vitamin D, is that a factor at all in this?
It sure can be. Its exact role in seasonal affective disorder, I think, is still being researched. But obviously, if you're not getting sufficient sunlight, you're not getting sufficient, vitamin D either, unless you're eating a really high-fat diet, because vitamin D is not stored in any organ; it's actually stored in fat tissue. Mm-hmm. So, animal fats are actually the richest natural dietary source of usable vitamin D. Vitamin D2, ergocalciferol, isn't particularly useful until it is acted on by sunlight in the presence of ample cholesterol in the skin. So we need the cholesterol
back to those animal fats again here. Although we make our own cholesterol, I understand, but
well, we do, but it's a laborious process to have to make your own all the time. It's better, when you can get it, in your diet and that kind of thing too. But mostly what you're doing when you're eating dietary cholesterol is you're you're telling your body that, okay, there's plenty, because it's a very, very important substance. I mean, every cell in our body has cholesterol. It's part of every cell membrane. Fully a fourth of all the cholesterol in the human body is in the human brain. And if it isn't there, we've got a problem. It's one of the common side effects of statin medications is our dementia-like symptoms.
Because you're just not getting enough cholesterol
Right.
in there to keep the brain fed with what it wants.
Right.
And
right.
it's built
it's
for.
important. You can't have normal nerve transmission. You can't have normal neurotransmitter activity without ample cholesterol. You can't have adequate brain stability without normal cholesterol. You're at higher risk for things like seizures and migraines and whatever else when your cholesterol levels are excessively low. So I'd rather see them on the high side, which means that cholesterol is doing its job, that it's doing whatever it's there to do. Cholesterol that's too low to me is much more worrisome than cholesterol that is quote unquote too high. And too high has never been scientifically defined. It has been arbitrarily designated, anything over 200, but there's no scientific basis to that,
Right.
to that
Right.
line.
Right.
In the sand. So.
In about our last 5-6 minutes here,
Yeah.
I want to go back to any other aspects of the adrenal, or not adrenal, the stress, I should say, and fatigue that we haven't.
Well, the body's response to stress and what we experience as stress. So some people have what they experience as hyper responses to stress because they have more of a midbrain dysregulation. Okay, so there's a structure in the middle of our brain called the mesencephalic midbrain, and that part of the brain is all about survival. It has the highest. That's where our brain produces its own version of adrenaline, which is norepinephrine, and it's also the first part of the brain to notice if we're in danger or not. And there's something called the reticular activating system that's constantly deciding what to pay attention to. Is this a threat? Is this a threat? Is this not? If it takes something in, perceives it as threatening, then it sends off this chain reaction, down the lateral horns of the spine and into the sympathetic chain. Sympathetic nervous system is our fight and flight nervous system, and it gets us all jacked up. Well, this is the part of the brain that gets dysregulated oftentimes when a person experiences a really traumatic event. And it just sort of there's something of that just sort of gets stuck in kind of a feedback loop over and over again. That's midbrain stuff. That part of the brain is also really, really sensitive to inflammation. It has the richest repository of what are called interleukin-6 receptors, which is another inflammatory cytokine. And so inflammation is something that can profoundly activate that part of the brain. So a person with food sensitivities and or is getting exposures to things that they're sensitive to, whether they're aware of it or not, that can also be triggering it can kind of prime them for more anxiety. These are oftentimes, too, the kinds of people that they don't like bright light. They'll wear sunglasses all the time, even in the early morning or, indoors. These are the kinds of people that are really sensitive to loud sounds. And they cannot stand crowds usually, or people standing close to them. Somebody comes up in their face, and it's just, these are the folks you just cannot drag for love or money, to a festival with you or anything like that. It's just not going to happen. So, and again, we're looking at mesencephalic midbrain things. Usually that part of the brain is something that there are a number of things that it can be responsive to, and I talk about those, in my book. The thing that was really important to me with this book was to be able to outline, give people the means of kind of screening themselves for what sort of fits them in terms of the type of adrenal dysregulation, because it's not all one thing. There are different ways in which adrenal dysregulation can manifest, and it can be autoimmune too. You can it is entirely possible to be producing antibodies against your own adrenal tissue, and that's not as uncommon as a lot of people might think. Mitochondrial dysfunction and anemia. There are all kinds of ways in which that our energy levels can be impacted in a way that mimics what you think of as adrenal burnout. It's not adrenal burnout. There really kind of isn't any such thing per se. But what my book is going to do is give people, I think, a real tool for self-empowerment to be able to go in there and kind of figure out where they fit in the scheme of these things. And it may be more than one thing, you know? We always hope it's just that one magic thing, right? But,
yes.
But, you know, you'll see yourself reflected in these different descriptions. And then I offer some suggestions for supporting that particular type of dysregulation, things that you can do, practical steps that you can take.
Yes.
Or these are the tests to take if you,
Yes.
this fits for you. You know, these are the, you know, what you need to ask your natural health care provider, your trusted health care provider, whoever they may be. And so this is really, it's, you know, most of what's going on in natural health today with respect to what we think of as adrenal problems is really based on 1950s science. You know, Dr. Hans Selye was this brilliant Canadian endocrinologist, and he was a Canadian. I mean, you know, what's not to love about that, right? Cool guy, eh?
Because you're Canadian originally. All right, go ahead.
I know. And he had a theoretical model about a progressive model of adrenal exhaustion. And, you know, the guy was nominated for the Nobel Prize multiple times. So he wasn't just some sort of fanciful, you know, weird fringe thinker. It was an interesting concept. It was an interesting theory, but it just hasn't borne out with respect to where the field of stress physiology has gone since then, since the 1950s, and the ways in which we now understand that that the adrenals themselves are really managed within the context of stress. And we have to look at it a little bit differently in order to be able to manage stress well, whatever that means to us.
Thank you. Okay, give us the title of the book again.
The title of the book again is Rethinking Fatigue, What Your Adrenals Are Really Telling You and What You Can Do About It.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you for that help, that guidance, and the practical side of that for all of us.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Janaea.
You're watching Peak Moment TV. I'm Janaea Donaldson, my guest, Nora Gedgaudas, giving you some tips here and a new book on stress and fatigue. Join us next time.